Well, good morning, everyone. I might as well begin. I feel like I have to shout since we have all this background noise. But for those of you, you probably read my bio. I serve as a director of a food and egg development center with the Regional Economic Development Authority in Montana, headquartered out of Great Falls, Montana.
You can speak up a little bit.
Yes.
Okay.
You got a lot of competition.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, here we go.
Right.
So I want to begin all of you by coming to my talk this morning. I'm curious, how many of you were getting a little bit excited about the Alternative Protein Show? Is anybody? Okay. So was I. And in fact, I think I annoyed the living hell out of my lovely wife over the past few months about the fact I was going to come out to San Francisco and talk to people about rural America and engaging rural America in the alternative protein space. And when we were back home at her family's cattle ranch, which runs about 300 head of Red Angus cattle an hour south of Jackson, my mother-in-law asked me, "What are you going to be doing out in San Francisco?" And I said, "Well, there's this alternative protein conference." And then they were like, "What's alternative protein?" I'm like, "Well, there's this plant-based stuff and protein isolates, and then we got this cellular agriculture, we have serum, we have bioreactors, we have stem cells." And they kept asking some different questions. And as my excitement went up and up and up, it was obvious, especially in hindsight, since that's 2020, that their excitement level went through the floor. And the reason why, they had plenty of things to be worried about when I talked to them. You know, I'm an agriculture economist, the people that study and understand consumer behavior when it comes to food and beverages. And I talked to them about the fact that when we look at food items, we can categorize them into two different attribute groups. On one side is process and content attributes, the things that we can touch and feel. And the other side are credence attributes, the things that we can't sense, the things we have to rely on a trust mechanism in the marketplace to know that they are there. And I talked to him about how this industry is starting to get the touch and feel and the texture right, and that this whole other thing on the credence attributes is where they're going to be even more powerful. I talked to him about the fact that as people become more affluent in the United States, their utility function changes. And what do I mean by that? We know that people try to maximize their marginal utility subject to a budget constraint under bounded rationality when they make a food choice. And so more and more the utility function is tied to moral and ethical variables. And when we start talking about environmental sustainability, and this is an agriculture economist who was born and raised in the cow town of Meeteetse, Wyoming, I'm just going to say that. When we talk about environmental sustainability and what we're doing in the environment with agriculture, they began to get concerned. And we also talked about what's going to happen by the time we get to 2050. All the people that are on beyond this globe, it's going to be hot and crowded, how we're going to feed them. And at the point I recognized that at the end they felt as if they were backed up into a corner and into a wall. And there they were sitting with their son-in-law, and they began to get fearful in the conversation, and they began to get a tad bit angry. Now, I don't know where you guys are from, but where I come from in the Rocky Mountain West, if you feel that you're backed up in the wall and you're in a corner and you look down at a ledge and you're going to fall off, you don't fall off. You come out of the corner swinging as hard as you can, and you fight until the living death to keep yourself surviving. And the reality is, for the alternative protein space, we do not want to be in that situation. Because I can tell you, as somebody who grew up in Wyoming and lives in Montana, if you're here in San Francisco and you call your U.S. Senator, you're somebody. But when you call a U.S. Senator in Wyoming, Montana, you're someone who they know, and they will go bat for you in Washington, D.C. every single day. So the reality is we need friends in rural America. And one of the things that resonated to me, my mother and father-in-law were talking about, was they hear all the time as beef producers, multi-generational families, that they're ruining the environment. There's people that have even said that today, that agriculture is ruining the environment, that cattle producers are ruining the environment, that chicken farmers are ruining the environment, that meat companies are ruining the environment. And the reality is, and I'm going to tell you this, but some of you will say, well, that's why we don't invite people from flyover country to talk in San Francisco. Agriculture itself is not ruining the environment. And I'm going to say that again. Agriculture is not ruining the environment. Who's ruining the environment? Look out there. Look at everybody that works in this city. Look at the 7 billion people across the globe. Humanity, through our consumption decisions, is forcing agriculture to respond in a way to fulfill our demand. Our choices across the globe is what agriculture is responding to. If you meet my mother and father-in-law at 7,000 feet in elevation in what some may say the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, and you talk to them about 3 generations of producing cattle, they don't see themselves as ruining the environment because that's not what they ever wanted to do. They were born and raised to help feed a population that needed protein, that needed food. Now, when we look at this as we approach 2050, we began to see the reality is really, it's not population growth as some of us know. When I was in 4th grade, I learned there to be 12.8 billion people by the time of 2050. That number is still in my head. But they've relaxed it down to 10 billion, but it doesn't really matter. And even that population growth is not what matters. Is the fact that over the next few decades, as we approach 2050, because of international trade, hopefully we keep international trade going. As we approach that point, economic development will drive consumer incomes across the globe. And agriculture economists have been talking about this for over 50 years. They talked about the Ingalls curve, which is a graphical depiction of what happens when your change in income affects your consumption decision. And a guy named Dr. Norman Rask over 30 years ago started talking about cereal equivalents. And he said that at the very beginning on the Ingalls curve, if you're poor, or you live in a low economic development country, you get most of your protein from what? Peas, lentils, chickpeas, garbanzo beans, or chickpeas, anything that's plant-based. As you get more income, you start sliding up that curve and you go for poultry, which in cereal equivalence term is 3 pounds of cereals or 3 pounds of grain to 1 pound of poultry. And then afterwards, depending upon culture, you go to pork, which is 5 to 1, and finally you get to the king of meat, beef. And I personally eat a lot of beef, and I'll tell you that, I'm not afraid to say that. But what scares the living hell out of me as an agriculture economist is when everybody in the world wants to eat as much beef as we do in the United States. And that's what ag economists have been talking about for years, is how that's in effect our demand. Now, as I said, we don't want to always attack agriculture, and we don't want to push agriculture producers into a corner, because if we do, we'll find that we create antagonists where we can really build people that are vocal supporters of alternative proteins in rural areas. And one of the things about that is there is a misnomer, I think, in many of the coastal cities that everybody that lives in rural America is directly engaged in agriculture. That's the way it was 80 years ago, 90 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, but it's no longer the case. So if you make that ranching family angry because everybody thinks they're attacking them and they go to their church or a synagogue or maybe a mosque, they go to the Lions Club, they go to Sir Optimus, they see people at a cafe and they spread the word, then people will be concerned about their friend. But the reality is, when we look at the population of rural America, the vast majority of people are not directly tied to agriculture. There are people that live in my rural community of 1,800 people in Choteau, Montana, that have to deal with rural poverty and would love it if somebody came and opened a business that employed 10 people or put in a plant that would employ 40 people. And when people start recognizing that rural America is ready for growth and economic development and is eager for alternative protein companies to locate there, you have an immense capacity to convert people that could be natural antagonists into being the most vocal supporters. Because then when that senator comes, like ours in Montana, John Tester, or our conservative senator comes, and they see this community and they talk to people and they talk to the superintendent of the school district, and he's like, this was amazing, they put this factory in here. We have more students now. Our tax base has increased because, they did this weird technology over there. And, it's a great building and we love this type of stuff. Then you get more political momentum even in Washington when you're dealing with regulation of USDA or FDA, or the new thing that's going to happen is how we handle these alternative proteins under our international trade agreements or TRQs, quotas, and SPS and TBT concerns. So that's one of the things, we have to recognize is how to properly engage. And you already saw in the write-up, and I don't want to belabor it, but we have lower location costs. People understand it makes sense. If you do all your startup operation and all your production operations in an urban center, it costs a lot of money. When those things can be done in rural areas for a much lower cost, bring in local populations to be advocates and supporters for the technologies, and be able to gain political momentum. The other things is more and more people in rural America, farmers themselves, are more concerned about climate change than the people that live here in San Francisco. If you're a barley farmer in the foremost barley growing region of the United States on the Fairfield Bench in Montana, they can talk your ear off about climate change because they see it every year when they plant their crops and they try to harvest them and they try to make malt and get more money for them. The people that understand climate change the most are living in rural America. They're not inhabiting the cities of our nation. One of the other things, though, when we recognize that we look at this, remember I talked a little bit at the very beginning of that high-level thing on consumer behavior, those credence attributes, right? If you think of it from the alternative protein space, what resonates more to people that feel-good part of your value hierarchy? How does that resonate when you say that we located in a city, we had this high amount of technology, we did all these isolates, we built these things in a laboratory? Does that resonate that well on a brand story? It doesn't. What resonates good on a brand story is the fact that you can say, we drove into technology, we made close relationships with land-grant universities who have built the backbone of the world's agricultural system and have fed billions and billions of people across this globe through technological advancement. You have a brand story when you say you located in that rural area and you helped them out, you provided jobs, and that their kids that were going off to be college educated now can come back and live there and have a good job with good benefits, and they can raise their kids there instead of having to go like I did when I graduated. I graduated in town of 351 people. Was there economic opportunity for me when I got done with my master's degree? No. So I went out to Washington, D.C., became a diplomat, served overseas, and finally my wife, who I know a lot, said we need to go home to rural America. But the reality is not everybody in rural America has the opportunity to go home. And if people, companies understand how to play with that brand story, it's going to be powerful, because the reality is, as I said, there's these credence attributes out there, and that utility function connect back to core and instrumental values that we all have. Core and instrumental values from a sociological perspective is what tells you how to vote. It tells you your political decision making. It tells you who you want to fall in love with. It tells you who you want to be a friend with. It tells you who you want to flip off at the end of the day. It's the very things that center us. And when these food credence attributes connect with the internal part of all of us, you win consumers over. Now, one of the things that I want to mention is that I also think fundamentally that we need, as everybody knows, if November 8th, 2016 did not wake people up in this country enough to understand that we have some massive divides between rural America and urban America, then I'm scared what will wake people up to understand that. Because I live in an island where a lot of people do not believe the way I do politically, I can tell you that. And they don't believe it because they see outside people attacking them. And I think the alternative protein space, as it interlines in with climate change and talking about environmental sustainability, offers an extremely powerful roadmap to private industry, to intellectuals and others to work together to start bridging gaps between urban and rural America. And if people that go to Stanford, or people that are out at MIT, and they're at Harvard doing research and stuff, start sitting down with people at Montana State University and start looking to research and saying how we can work together. And to remember that agriculture in this nation is classified as a public good. I'm going to say that again. It is a public good. It's the same as the military. It's the same as roads and bridges. It's been that way since Thomas Jefferson put out the idea of a yeoman farmer. It's what, as I can tell you, being a diplomat that served overseas on behalf of USDA, we are the envy in the world of how we coalesce around agriculture. Now, one of the things we're doing in Montana, as I said, we have lower location costs, just as many rural areas, but we're also seeing, specific to the plant-based community, that we have a huge disconnect when we talk about plant-based proteins. So that's why, just a little pitch, but if we would like to invite everybody out the third week of June to crisscross around the state with us and to have some damn good microbrews that are better than any you will find here in the San Francisco Bay. You're not going to find the other stuff you smell on the streets here, but you'll find better beer. And really talk about how it is we move these industries forward together. And there's people here from international countries. You may ask, why is it so important that we have success in rural America? And I can tell you, one of the things is I inherently, no matter what's happened over the past 2 years, still believe that America is great. And that much of that greatness, if not all of it, is derived from the very basic fact that we, as Americans, are comprised of humanity. We are comprised of every national origin, of every race, of every ethnicity, of every religion, every history, and every her story from the world over. And when we can come together as a country to push forward and call for a new common agricultural revolution that will revolutionize the human race and our natural environment, when we can find a way to do that together as a country, then it says that the human race can do it together as a world. And when we really recognize that and take a moment to look in the mirror and feel as if we can all work together and to bridge these gaps, I think the alternative protein space will be ensured a solid future. So I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any or comments.
Could you say more? I think this story you told about your in-laws is really useful.
Yeah.
But could you tell us more about what do people think about alternative protein at all, if at all, in your part of the world? What kinds of conversations are people having?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I live in a cattle-centric part of what we call the Golden Triangle of Montana, and a lot of my friends are cattle ranchers and others. And it's interesting when we look at age breaks, right? So like my in-laws, they look at it, they're liberal-leaning, they're college-educated, which was rare at that time, went back to the ranch, and they're just afraid of it because they've spent their whole lives doing it. And they had expected at some point that their kids would take it over. And they know that things are changing and that culture, that being that they had, may not continue. While younger ranchers that talk to are like, wow, it's kind of interesting. They recognize there's change, but they also say if there's going to be change, I want to be part of it. Because if I'm part of it, then I'll be ensured that I'm not left behind. And there's definitely some people, I've gone to some conferences in Montana, the thing is they want to talk about is fake meat. Fake meat. Well, that's because some people decide to call it clean meat. And that's something that I think actually really is the biggest issue I've heard from cattle producers and others, is the nomenclature. And we have to recognize, and I don't think it's recognized with the alternative protein movement, of why it's such a big issue. If you go to cattle country in the Rocky Mountains, they will tell you about how they've sued the living hell out of USDA to say, we will not pay for the beef checkoff. Because us promotion of beef, you know, there was a knock talking about beef, what's for dinner this morning? If you resonated that and took Bruce's comments and put that in rural America, there'd be a lot of cattle ranchers that would have a bone to pick about that. Because they'll tell you the federal government forced them into a marketing order and they were taxed. And the benefit of that went to middlemen and packers. And they have paid every year to promote the name of beef. And so when alternative protein companies want to come in and call something beef, they want to call it an egg or something else, the bone that they have to pick about it is that they have spent a lot of money that came out of the pockets of producers to promote those names in the marketplace. And I think that some of the headway that's been made talking with AMI and other companies about a roadmap is good, but I think that nomenclature specifically, coming to terms with that, can be very helpful.
Do you have terms that you would advocate for?
You know, I have thrown lots of things in my head and I have not found something resonant. I mean, if people are so tied to saying, well, it's beef because it comes from beef stem cells, then call it bovine. You know, if people really want to be tied to that, then call it that. But I think that that's one of the biggest hang-ups. And that's what I think the alternative, if I said that, you know, that concept of getting pushed into a wall, I mean, I'm a pretty good political person. I used to be involved in international trade negotiations. I used to sit down with the president with no tie and very relaxed and figure out how we can introduce biotechnology into countries that are against it. And the reality is don't pick a fight unless you have to. I'm a fairly sizable guy. I played rugby in college. The only person I've ever been in a fist fight with is my brother. That's because I use what God gave me up here to figure out how to never have to use these.
So with a cell-cultured meat company, cell-based meat.
Yeah, I've seen your YouTube videos. Yeah.
So what then are these? So you said, essentially, I just want to know, what should we be emphasizing because I'm going to be speaking to USDA, I'm going to be speaking to the Cattlemen Association, etc. What do you think we should be emphasizing? Right now I say jobs, right? So you gave the example of they're really happy when 40 jobs are created, etc. So we can create jobs in the center of the country. But what else? Like what actually speaks to people? They get some perk upset. Hey, they're on our side, or this is a better future for all of us.
So who are you talking? What cattle group are you talking to?
So the National Cattlemen Association.
NCBA.
Yeah.
Why are you talking to them?
Well, it's typically that events. So in October we went to the FDA and the USDA joint regulation meeting. They were there and chat into me standing back and shouting across each other. So
this is just me, the old diplomat in me, that was very successful in introducing biotechnology into Guatemala, where they believed that their hombres de maíz, that they were created from corn instead of the soil in the Judeo-Christian philosophy, which was always deemed hard to get in the corn. You don't interact with them. Don't talk to them. Talk to the people you want to be your audience. Does that make sense? NCBA is not your concern. As I just said, the vast majority of people who live in rural America are not cattle ranchers. They're not directly involved in agriculture. They're hungry for jobs. If somebody wants to pick a fight with you from NCBA, which does not generally represent all producers in the country, it's a forced organization between producers, packers, retailers, and everybody, there's no reason to have to waste time to engage within that environment. Engage who you want to win over. Choose your world sphere, choose how you want to communicate, and then work to gain adherence. And if you're talking to USDA, don't worry about FSIS, APHIS, and the others. Go and knock on the halls of USDA Rural Development, R&D. It's on the 3rd floor, 2nd wing of the USDA South building off the Smithsonian exit. I know because I worked in that building for 3.5 years. You have to pick your audience where you'll get the greatest adherence and you'll get the greatest political support. But getting mired down in what people think in the groups they tell you should be talking to, honestly, if you want to get to your end goals, then be an ultimate waste of time. And that is my personal, as I learned when I was in the government before, they always said, you always have to leave that with personal opinion so it doesn't go back to your employer. That's my personal opinion. But it's somebody, and I'm happy to talk more in depth on that subject with you. I don't know if anybody else has any.
So yes, I'm a little bit curious. So
Yeah.
when alternative protein companies, they locate in rural America, what kind of employees they can recruit there?
Well, so here's something. She was asking if an alternative protein company were to locate in rural America, what type of employees could they recruit there? So I just think about like a rural community where I live. There's some of us that have master's degrees. There's people like my wife who's a veterinarian with a PhD and can do a lot of things in a laboratory. There are people that are there that can do scientific jobs, they can do marketing jobs. But the other reality is there's a lot of people in cities like this, or New York City or Boston, that if you were to say they could live in a rural area and have a quality school and access to the natural environment, to federal public lands, and get paid a good chunk of change, you will find people that are willing to make the move every single day. And I say that based upon a conversation I had with a person that used to be the head of Google Maps, had 15,000 employees, woke up one day in San Francisco and was like, what am I doing here? Or another guy I know who used to be a PhD behavioral physicist that taught electrons how to move around in microchips. He woke up one day and was like, what am I doing here? And so there's an ability to use the employees we have, but there's also an ability to get relocation of employees to areas where they would love to live if they were given the economic opportunity. It's kind of a chicken and egg. We don't have people moving to rural areas because there's no jobs, and people say they can't put a business in a rural area because there's nobody to work. But the reality is pick the correct rural area, and you'll find people are willing to go there. So I guess that's probably everybody's done. So.